Just got a new watch for my wife. It's a Shinola watch. I don't know if any of you have seen this, but the reason I'm showing off my wife's gift me is that it's made in Detroit. And one of the things I want to talk about today is the industrial renaissance that's being permitted, not guaranteed, but permitted by the shale revolution. Some of the things that are going on, making energy both more abundant, cheaper, and more proximate to end use. So I will use the watch for the purposes it's intended, not as some kind of prop in a lecture, but to remind me to stay talking for no more than 25 minutes, if I may, Madam President. The book, very kind of you to mention. I think even the remaindered copies of it have long ago disappeared. But it was the book that I did when I got to Washington, and of course it's sensational. It's a page turner. Every observation was correct. I invite you to go try to find a remaindered copy. There is a book on its way, and I am hugely embarrassed to say I got the money for it from a generous foundation 10 years ago. And I keep finding reasons not to finish it. So I just turned off a trip that I was going to be making, which was a frivolous trip to Central Europe, to Bulgaria. I'd never been, and that was the reason to go. It seemed a pretty stupid reason, really. And I just called up and I said, no. And they said, James. And I said, no, I can't. I've got to finish the book. And then they said something terrible. You always say that. I didn't realize it become my standard excuse. So I'm going back to finish the book. And right now, I want to thank you very much for having me here. I've driven up from New Mexico, going through the most extraordinary landscapes, and I'm sort of full of it, and bored people at the speaker's table with my excitement. But luckily, Mr. Link, where he is, there he is, a geologist who corrected me. In fact, he corrected me in about everything I was saying. But he told me that it's not a chimney rock that I was enthused about. It's an erosional remnant. An erosional remnant. That sounds rather like my 20-year-old son's attitude toward me. Anyway, my interest in energy stems from the other part of my life, which was involved in living in New Zealand. New Zealand has electricity is generated by what source of power more than any other? Geothermal. Who said that? Who's the smart boy in the class? Well done, sir. Geothermal, top of the class. You're quite right. And when I was in the New Zealand Foreign Ministry, and we'll get to that at question time, because I sometimes wonder how I managed to do that, I was in charge of a geothermal power project in Java, the first one in Southeast Asia. And I began to see, even back then, when I was confronted by a terrifying array of Indonesian officials, some of whom spoke Dutch, I thought, gosh, energy is really connected with just about everything. It certainly was with money, it certainly was with political power, it certainly was with demands. You can get, populations in cities generally will put up with an awful lot, but they won't put up with a lack of electric power. It's become the lodestone for legitimacy of governments, whether it was the Soviet government in the 1920s and so on. I won't belabor the point. But I found, after I took a professorship at Georgetown, that someone emerged in my life again by the name of Daniel Yergin. Does anyone know that name? Right? He's about to wrote the prize, really the sort of great name and energy, and he had become my friend when I was a lost New Zealander at Harvard in the 80s. And he said, I remember you, would you like to do our political work? And I said, well, that's a pretty big brief, what do you mean? He said, well, I want you to specifically tell our clients about political risk involved with national oil companies in Asia. And so I did. And sort of in that way, kind of backed into the energy field again. I'm giving you this background because it's really important that you understand that I'm not a geologist, I'm not a field engineer, I'm not a petroleum scientist, I'm not. I've picked up a little bit along the way, but my work in energy was and remains knowing what a set of characters in Asia inside these very rich and politically very malleable companies are going to be doing. There's another thing too, having been born in America but being away for 29 years, I'd come back, but I didn't really live until I came back in the 90s, was I was really surprised at the acquiescence the US had in the deindustrialization of this country. It's kind of an interesting thing if you think about it, that people who had MBAs and thought that computer chips and potato chips were in a kind of balance sheets, sense were the same thing. I couldn't understand this. So I began to wonder why the American advantage was, in a sense, being dissipated. And I'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation. Let's try to begin thinking about energy in a sense of a recent phenomenon that is really overtaken, I think, our perception of what's going on in the energy world in the United States today. And that is the whole question of shale, hydraulic fracturing, shale development, extracting gas and oil from something that has a consistency of very hard concrete, and how people had been thinking about doing this for many, many years. They often think that hydraulic fracturing, the weasel word there, like erosional remnant, the weasel word there is enhanced recovery. But the enhanced recovery had been going on, and who could guess what the first attempt to frack, and it was successful, it was just rather dangerous, what element was used in the first attempts to frack or enhanced recovery in the Pennsylvania fields? Nitroglycerin. You would just pick it up and hurl it into the well and see what happened. First fracking actually happened in the late 1880s, as far as I remember. And the whole question of enhanced recovery, or smashing up the rock that you're drilling into, is not new. That's the major thing. And more generally, enhanced recovery using methods, including hydraulic fracturing, is part of a drilling process that applies to just about all petroleum drilling anywhere. So, we tended to get wrapped up about this because of the enormous increase in oil and gas enabled by extraction from shale. Who can guess? Well, let's try it another way. As recently as 2005, I was watching a panel of the most intelligent people in the energy world speaking at the annual CERA Week, Cambridge Energy Research Associates, CERA. CERA Week, it's the annual conference of the industry in Houston. And they were setting out what seemed to be an incontrovertible case that the United States was running out of natural gas, that we were going to need to import LNG, liquid natural gas, right? That 6 terminals need to be done, and it needed to happen right away. Well, all of those terminals are now being reverse engineered for the possibility of exporting LNG to overseas markets. Think of it, 2005. I mean, my son, of course, thinks it's ancient history, but I think 2005 was not that long ago. And, we came from a position where we were producing domestically about 8% of the world's oil supply to about 15 today. We are now the leading oil and gas producer in the world, ahead of the Saudis, right? I mean, it's astonishing to kind of think that way, because we're still locked in this 1970s sense of energy dependence, of energy security being other people possessing the resource and holding us to ransom. In fact, this very, very interesting process has occurred, and it was enabled by 2 things that we don't often think about. The rise of which region enabled the maintenance of petroleum prices to be at their level for many years? Well, it's Asia, right? It's Chinese demand, Indian demand. So the high floor prices were largely characteristic of the 2000s, right? Up to 2014. We'll get to the whole Saudi approach to trying to undercut American shale production by producing at a rate which keeps prices low, and therefore they think will drive American producers out of business. Those high floor prices enabled by Asia's development, and then there's a phrase called energy intensivity. It just simply means how much energy you have to use in a manufacturing process. If you've got a factory, how much energy does it use? Well, Asian industrialization tends to be very highly energy intensive. So it meant that they were really in the market to buy gas, to buy oil, and many other things too, meant that the American firms, and I'll show this in a slide in a second, that were successfully applying a set of techniques which came together in the mid-2000s. I mean, they had been there before, but the productive impact of them transformed the environment in only the mid-2000s. All of those things were enabled by a floor price. And of course, prices at the end of the day set the direction of the whole thing. The pivot, therefore, was the mid-2000s, resulting from the intersection of 3 and arguably 4 trends. And there's a lovely slide here in a moment I'll show. Seismology, right? Including remote-controlled seismology. I mean, wellhead operations, which are increasingly automated and are conducted very long distance. It's very weird to go to some of these sites and you're like, where is everybody? Where's Daniel Day-Lewis getting covered with oil and things spouting out? And wait a minute, this isn't the movies. And it isn't the movies because the cumulative effect of these monitoring supervisory seismographic changes are huge. The next thing, of course, was horizontal drilling. Horizontal drilling, being able to take the pipe and go that way rather than straight down. That wasn't the well that Daniel Day-Lewis had as either, because it's extraordinary how much has occurred. Can anyone tell me what they think is the area in which horizontal drilling first became pioneered and was used? Offshore drilling, because it's so expensive to put down a well offshore, hugely expensive. So why just go down if you can go out this way? DWD is the jargon. If you want to impress people at your next dinner party, say, well, we have an advantage in DWD, and see if they know what the hell you're talking about. But horizontal drilling, and there the change has just been nothing short of astonishing. Nothing short of astonishing. And I remember being in Tulsa, I was talking to a group like this, and I was saying, it's just amazing how many different wells, producing wells horizontally you can get out of one initial well. And someone stood up in the back and he said, Professor Clad, I have to take issue with you. And I thought, Joe, I'm cooked. Because this guy, this is Tulsa, petroleum industry, the whole thing. Moreover, he was head of one of the country's major drilling firms. And I thought, I'm doomed. I'm humiliated in front of all these people. He said, no. He said, you just understate the extent of the change. And then this is 5 or 6 months ago. He said, we just spudded in. We didn't have to wait for the vertical well to finish before we put down the horizontal things. We went out in something like 15 directions at a level of 2 kilometers, went in directions of 5 or 6 kilometers, all producing within 14 days. Now, maybe the geology was propitious. Maybe it was an exceptional thing, but that is nothing short of revolutionary. So horizontal drilling, and then, of course, improved fracturing, right? Which is, the bête noire of the environmental lobby. And I'm not saying they don't have reason to be concerned, or at least to ask questions. This is a country where we respond to those things with a regulatory response. But hydraulic fracturing really came into its own. And one of the things that the environmental lobby doesn't and can't understand, neither can we, it's guesswork, is that the things that are most valuable in many of these companies that are doing fracking is their technology of hydraulic fracturing, reducing the amount of water, using fine particulate matter, tweaking it to get more and more production out of the well. So hydraulic fracturing, seismology, horizontal drilling, and you'll see it in the slide, government policy. Now, I go to places where everyone goes, the government, the only good thing with the government is throw it out. But honestly, you can track it back to Carter's subsidies and other things, that there's a line in the research development which meant that government tax credits and all the rest of it made the big difference. So we are, if we want to think about possessing oil and gas as ours, and it's not ours because the price is set globally, but we're now at self-sufficiency. And the question of what we're going to do with it is going to be very, very interesting. Okay, well, it's a very big, pompous topic, isn't it? World politics of a changing energy landscape. Oh, do you have 5 weeks? Can we talk this over in detail? So we're going to have to go through it rather smartly. This, all of you, it's going to be difficult for some of you to see. That's why I want you to see the slides later. But this is a map of the shale plays in the United States. The first thing to remember is, just like the weather map, on CNN, the bad weather doesn't stop at North Dakota. It goes into Canada. Heard of that? It's a North American. So if you look at the back and field at the top there in the Dakotas, the geologists are saying that runs very far into Canada, right? Similarly, in the south, Eagle Ford doesn't just stop at the Rio Grande. It goes well into Mexico, Chihuahua, a number of other areas. So there's another thing too. If you look on the West Coast and you look at the Monterey Basin, what does that, I'm going to ask the geologist resident, what does the Monterey Basin suggest to you? It suggests the largest untapped source of oil in the United States. The conservative estimates are that there's enough oil there to keep the country, assuming we want to stick with the hydrocarbon economy, for something like 100 years. It's just that it's in California, and you try telling the trust fund babies of Santa Barbara that they're going to have a forest of derricks out in front of the city, and it isn't going to happen. Next slide, please. So that's a picture of shale, the shale plays. The major ones right now are Bakken and Marcellus for oil and gas, respectively, which are North Dakota, and Marcellus is Pennsylvania. Right. Does this need an explanation? At the very bottom, if you look, you'll see it's the United States, Europe, and Japan. All this is showing the British thermal units, is just showing the relative prices. Forget the actual costs and BTUs. The relativities are what's involved here. We are way, way, way cheaper than the EU and Japan, and China's even higher than that. Next slide, please. And of course, to have those competitive gas prices means you are in a competitive environment in a situation where companies like Siemens of Germany and a number of other firms that are involved in manufacturing want to locate here, because with relativities that are sometimes 6 or 7 to 1 cheaper here, and with fuel not just as a thing to generate power, but also as a feedstock. Say you make fertilizers or chemicals or plastics. It's really significant. This is, I put in the American Revolution because this is the shale revolution. If you look at what's going on here, the production just continues. And the August figure shows it going up again. That the production from a really small number of rigs, we had 1,700 rigs in June 2014 working in shale development. It's under 600 now. So again, the efficiencies can be tracked. And it's extraordinary. And it's nearly 10 million barrels a day. And that means we are the world's leading oil producer. There it is. That's the evidence. Next slide, please. This is the slide that I mentioned. It's horribly complicated in a way, but you can see the 3 lines converge, and then a 4th below the main axis converges there in the mid-2000s. And this was done by a friend with whom I'm writing about fracking and the shale revolution. But you can see the top line is the, what is it? Yeah, horizontal drilling. The next is it's hard to read for this, the fracturing, and the next is seismographic. The 4th, often neglected, especially when you go to the petroleum industry's meetings, because the government can't do anything right. The truth is that an awful lot of breaks and inducements provided by the government and state governments as well led to this enormous increase in shale production. And there's the productive act line behind it. It's a rather interesting graph. Next, please. This just shows Chesapeake's, second Q 2015 earnings. And this is, they can't kid their shareholders. They can't kid the industry. What they're showing here is a reduction in cost, average spud to spud days, meaning from drilling a new well to drilling another well are reduced. The drilling cost goes down. The drilling cost per foot of well drilled, look at it, it's almost arithmetic. It just keeps declining, which means that they're able to make money in this environment, right? With $55 oil, there'll be a 25% rate of return to most companies working it. This is the great fallacy in the Saudi argument, that they were able to drive the industry to the wall just because of price. They forget that this country, unlike Saudi Arabia, has people who are familiar with starting companies and ending them, people who go to the market for bond and for equity capital. This year alone, there's been $55 billion of new equity from Wall Street in these firms, which are supposedly heading for the wall. So something's happening. Next slide. I think this is the one. I know it's difficult for people there to see it properly, but this is Baker Hughes data and something from the government as well. But if you look, the rig number, this is the blue line, which just falls away with the Saudi challenge, right? Uneconomic drilling can't be managed. But the black line, the dark one, is production. So it went, I remember I told you that it was up at 1,600 rigs, and then it slid down. I know some of you can't see. But down here, it's to nearly 600. And interestingly, the rig count's going back up again. In other words, they've managed this competitive challenge. lest you think that doesn't matter, oil a little more than a year ago was 110 bucks a barrel. It's now hovering at what, 42, 46. It's not fun. People are having a hard time to, make money, but the market seems to think they're going to stay the course. Next slide. This just shows, again, incrementally where gains are coming. New well gas production per rig. Marcellus, big gas field. Some of the other ones back end, you see there on the left, that's primarily oil, tight oil. But again, this is just a spread of 1 year, and look at the productivity improvements achieved in an environment where the price has been more than halved and where the rig count has gone down by about 70%. It's pretty amazing. Next. This shows what's out there in the world. And the reason I put this in is because we're not the only place to have shale deposits, right? And in fact, it doesn't even show, it's because this is a Mercator projection, you can't really show Sumatra, which is this island right here. You can't really show it very well, but there's a lot of shale potential there. But there's a reason why it works in this country and in this continent better than any other place in the world. And what would that be? I'm going to be the schoolmaster here and ask for some thoughts about what makes it possible to have the type of gains that I've described to you and tried to depict for you graphically here. What makes it possible to do that in the US? Private enterprise. Well, that's we all stand up and salute for that, and I completely agree. It is private enterprise. It's pretty hard to do in a socialist system, but hard to do anything. But I would say, unless there's some more thoughts on this, it's subsurface mineral rights. Right? A landowner is interested in having Cabot Oil or somebody show up and drill this. Of course, he better negotiate a good lease and get the market conditions right and all the rest of it. But subsurface mineral rights are very, very important. The other thing too is that, as I said earlier, we have a startup culture. Everyone thinks, how are you managing if you sort of, wring your hands in dismay and you meet an oil and gas person? He says, we run into this kind of stuff all the time. We form companies, we leverage them as much as we can. We try to get a good return to investors, and we wind up the companies, or we mergers and acquisitions. Another thing that's never mentioned is we have an amazingly compliant and adaptive workforce. Try sacking 20,000 field hands in France, which is what's happened in some of the fields in the last 7 or 8 months. 20,000 people, temporary workers, have lost their jobs. Try doing that in France. I wouldn't count on, an acquiescent labor force. So we do have a very malleable labor force that puts up with highly volatile conditions. We have proprietary intellectual property, the very thing that's enabled these people to do so well. And we have the type of efficiencies I described to you. So it's all over there. And you notice these more accurately portray the shale potential of Canada and Mexico. Right? And that's why I think, and of course the market and perturbations and prices, all of this is never going, there's no straight line to nirvana for oil and gas or for anything, assuming you want a hydrocarbon economy. But there is a very well-founded sense that the North America is going to be more and more a single energy province, to use the word. That the joint ventures that are coming once the price improves with the Mexicans. Remember, Mexicans had this kind of old-style state socialism, 1930s government company, and they would not have joint ventures with anybody. Well, they're going to once the price picks up, because they've made the fundamental philosophic change. Okay, next slide. And I'm conscious that we've only have limited time, but I want to get through this. I put this up because you go out there and ask anybody, what is our oil dependency? They'll say Middle East. Everybody's like locked in this sort of time warp. You could make a good sci-fi movie of everybody, being in the 1970s with bad hair and platform shoes and an attitude to energy security. But look at it. The Middle East sends its oil to Asia, right? And the one line that comes from an oil producer, the green line, is actually Nigeria. And Nigeria produces a very, very sweet, meaning low sulfur crude that our refiners like. One of our problems, by the way, and I'm anticipating one of the issues about the questions that we have to think about is that the refiners in this country don't like to change. They don't want to actually shift, because cracking, crude oil is a chemical process, and they have a cracking regimen in place, and they want to continue to get imported oil, but there's no need if they change the way they crack some of the oil. So there are other factors also that make North American the place for fracking. And something that's happening internally in this country, we'll go to the next slide because I think that touches on it. No, yeah, well, we'll get there indirectly. This is a useful slide because it shows that China, and remember, this has to be seen as contingent upon a very complex winding down of the Chinese economic achievement that's going to be essentially financially based because it's built on air, an awful lot of their financial, there's a great deal of capital flight going on. If any of you have buddies in the Federal Reserve here, the Fed's in Denver, isn't it? Ask them about capital flight from China. You have to get them drunk first, but they'll talk. China is at least contracted to commission to put in all this stuff. Look at it, coal, problem, tick, gas, tick, nuclear, tick, renewables as well. You go out to Xinjiang, and I was just amazed when I went out there and saw all of the wind farms that were out there to meet the insatiable demand for power. India as well, look at the coal use. But look at the way the United States is moving away from coal. And look at the way the European Union is trying to, until the Germans decided they were so spooked by what happened in Japan that they would not use nuclear anymore. So guess who's made out like bandits selling coal to Germany? West Virginia. Go figure. It's been one of the things that's somehow assuaged and lessened the burden of having to adjust to a world, which I'll show you graphically in just a moment, a world in which coal is being retired, and that's the technical term, from its use as a power generator. And then you see Japan always stuck where it is. So you see, graphically you can see why the one thing, if you're really concerned, as I am, about the global warming issue, and especially the filthy air, if you go to India and China, who's been to China recently and had to breathe some of that pea soup? Ghastly. I've refused to go. I just won't. They said, but I don't want to go. Don't want to go. I'll go, in certain months where the winds come, but not summer. So get rid of coal as a power generator in India and China, and you would be doing more for the planet than anything else. Okay, next. Isn't this a great slide? Look at what this says visually. It says that coal-fired generator retirement. See, I told you it's a real word. It isn't just about getting old. And look at the distribution there. The coal is just this last May, natural gas superseded coal as the primary source of electricity generation fuel in the country. That's a very big deal. That's a very big change. Can you guess why people like coal? Apart from price and all the rest, and apart from the fact that it's there and we have existing coal-fired plants. If you're running a power plant, why do you like coal more than gas? Come on, think. That's right, you can store it. So if you have a peak load problem, suddenly everybody has to have 3 air conditioners running. You can meet the power demand by going out behind and getting your bulldozer to push the coal into the furnace. And that leads to a really important question, which is, it's great to have all this natural gas enabled by shale, but it's got to get to end use. And that gets to our phobia, our neuralgia about pipelines. But more on that in a minute. Next. But just before you change the slide, you see what is happening is just this, for this year alone, I think 200, there's something like, let me get this right. Yeah, 80 coal-fired power stations are being retired and being replaced by natural gas. And the sad thing is, I know these guys who work for Duke Energy, which is a great firm, Southern Power, they're trying to have clean coal. Some of you visited Washington 5 or 6 years ago in the metro system. There were banners everywhere, clean coal, the future. But they just can't do it. I've talked to the guys that are the technical guys there. It's just too hard. We can, it's like growing bananas at the South Pole if you want to. In New Zealand, we used to say, you can grow bananas at the South Pole, but of course it's like, well, why? but then the cost of it. And this is similar with clean coal. To do everything proper, to be able to reach levels of combustion that are just as clean comparatively, remember, it's comparative, as natural gas, it's just not price competitive. And then the regulatory thing is pushing them out. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you, Jim. Yes, I mentioned earlier that the sweet point had happened where natural gas had come up in that circled point on the graph there to begin to push coal aside. There's a feeling coal will always be part of our energy generation mix, always being a big word, but that natural gas is come out. And that's the thing that people forget about when they talk about the price problem for people involved with shale development, with fracking. They think that it's just about oil. It's not about oil. Most of these companies have gas as well as oil in their portfolio. So they're able to carry a lot of these costs. And that while price of gas has gone down, I showed you the graphs, it's still very, it's being sold because of the huge transformational shift to generate electricity with gas. Enabled by the way, fabulous technology from firms like General Electric. The meteorological advances in this fan blade technology, a guy tried to explain it to me, my eyes dilated, I just couldn't follow the argument, but it sure sounded important. And, and he described a situation, he said, yeah, well, you do this and you do that and you get this thing and you get combustion rates this, and we're getting 25% more power from 30% less gas. So never forget those efficiency arguments. Okay, next please. See what I mean about coal? See, without China, it was mostly flat, going right back to 2000, right? With China, it's appalling. The best way is if you have any Chinese friends, shame them over this thing, because that thing is leading to change. And remember, the reason they don't immediately just decide that it's going to be gas and coal's out of the way is because it's inextricably linked with the patronage of the Communist Party, right? And if your buddy, who you swore you'd look after all his life, is in charge of state coal factory number 5 or state coal mine, you're going to continue to give him business. That's how it goes. But the consequences for people having to live in Chinese cities is horrible, and for the world. Next. Okay, this requires, squint a bit, look at it. Basically, if you look where the United States is and you see the horizontal graph, that is a graph of attempting to show independence or dependence. We're the only country headed toward less dependence, more independence. And by the way, this slide is slightly out of date. The angle of the dip for American withdrawal from dependence on foreign supply is even more acute. China, India, EU, and of course, poor old Japan is always up there now and forever because they don't have resources of any kind that they can get to, except I suppose wind power and nukes. So there again, this shale revolution, this phenomenon, has transformed the world of energy. Okay, next slide. I think we're about done. Yeah, this thing, I hope, don't get confused about it. I looked at it today and I was thinking, does this slide make sense? And I think it does, so bear with me. The shaded thing in yellow just is showing, so that for ready identification, what is represented by that bar graph for the United States. And the line shows the cost advantage that we have. And you can see that as a composition of total costs, and this is from, what is it, from Boston Consulting, it's not very clear about this gray thing there, other what? Is it legal? I mean, what goes into the total cost of manufacturing? But you can see that electricity and natural gas are a very small component of cost of manufacturing in the US, as opposed to these other places. That's the reason why there is a huge movement by chemical firms and other manufacturers in Europe to site and relocate in the US. Okay, next. This is just a, almost a throwaway slide. It just simply shows that you get the gas, you get ethane, it's cracked, and then it is a derivative, it's a raw material for so many different things. I tend to be a bit squeamish about, I don't want to be like seen as a promo man for the plastics industry, that would be too much. But I think that it's an example of, there are many other industries out there, the fertilizer industry, right? Energy intensive, or feedstock-intensive industries are staging a huge comeback in this country. It's not widely appreciated, but it is. It's coinciding with another phenomenon, which is called the reshoring phenomenon. Does anybody know what that means? Reshoring means people who moved to China are now beginning to come back because the advantages of the China market are no longer so obvious. Labor costs are higher, it's corrupt, they steal your intellectual property. It's a long way to send stuff, on ships that are full of toys and then go back empty. That's the story. So this is something to follow very, very closely, and I've written about it, and I'll send you a thing that I did on the prospects for, selective reindustrialization in the U.S. If you care about these things, I do. I think a country should make things as well as just be a financial intermediary and sell hamburgers, to be crude and simplistic about it. Next. I hope that's self-explanatory. It simply shows the chemical industry and how the shale gas are related to investments. And they are huge. Look at the graph line. Look at the amount of inward investment or domestic investment in just the chemical industry. It tends to be concentrated around the Gulf, but it's big. And you can do other things that look at bauxite, for example, or cement or steel. Even a minor revival of the steel industry is partially attributable to lower energy prices and availability of energy enabled by shale. Okay, next, this may be the last one. I remember I talked a little bit about the whole infrastructure problem, which is, great, we've got this stuff, but how do we get it to where it's needed to both generate power and to, send it to the refineries and all the rest of it? Well, the truth is, despite our neuralgia for pipelines, exemplified by Keystone controversy, pipelines are actually quite managed. I mean, they're all over the world, and they're not, blowing up all over. Nobody can promise a perfect working environment, but we need a better pipeline network to reach the fields, to get this to the power stations, and we probably need pipelines for safety reasons ahead of railways. There's a reason why the Railway Associations show, we're moving 50 gazillion thousand billion tons of stuff on a teaspoon of fuel. Those ads show these trains going by. Well, yes, maybe, but they're on rail beds that haven't really been looked at for a long time with high center of gravity rolling stock. And by the way, if you look at what happened in Quebec and West Virginia, these things do occasionally run off with disastrous consequences. In other words, we've got 21st century technology tweaking stuff below the ground. And we're in a situation where we're the leading oil and gas producer of the world, and the infrastructure simply, guess what, hasn't kept up with it, just as it hasn't kept up with us with railways or roads or bridges or anything else. So it's an infrastructure question that we'll need to look at. Let me wrap up with a couple thoughts, because I'm conscious that I'm over time. The big things that are coming up with this energy abundance that I described to you is this question of, are we going to export or not? No prizes for guessing which companies don't want us to export gas. Well, come on. The chemical companies that are going to do very nicely out of really, really cheap gas here and fear that if we're selling it abroad, the prices domestically will go up, right? That is perfect economic logic. So we're going to have to decide whether it's a zero-sum game, and everything I learned in economics says that it's stupid to be mercantilist about, that's the fancy word, like you get the stuff and you hold on to it and don't let anybody have it, and you don't monetize it. Whereas arguably, if we're selling gas abroad, LNG, that will create a bigger market for extracting more gas here and will give the companies doing it more viability in the world stage and effectively bring prices down and maybe do something about the air quality in those Chinese cities. So export is a very big issue. Exporting crude. You know what? Everybody knows in the industry that we're already doing it. We're kind of pretending. They'll put tight oil, it's called, from shale, and they'll put it through a cracker. Once, they'll have a little bit of refining process, and then, boom, it's been refined, now we can sell it. I think that little bit of pretense is going to disappear. Beyond that, as I said, the big issue is whether the availability of fuel that I'm talking to you about, the shale-enabled abundance of both oil and gas, is going to allow us to do things a little bit differently. The there's no particular reason why, with the price of gas, we can't compress it, sell it, and change the engines in the long-haul transport fleet, the big trucks. Everyone keeps predicting it's going to happen. And look at the price of diesel now. It's often more expensive than highest grade octane. So one thing that could happen, and could happen very quickly, is that you'll change the type of fuel that the big trucks are using. And there are many other things in play that I don't have time to belabor at the moment. But this question of the reindustrialization of the United States, selectively based on the availability of cheap and abundant fuel, and then finally, really finally, I promise, Madam President, I'll get off the podium in a moment, that having this resource has enabled us to do a lot of things that have led to beneficial results. Whatever you think of the Iranian agreement, they only came to the table because of, look, prices were $110, and we were able to impose sanctions precisely because we had shale oil out there in the market, right? So, and the same thing with the Russians. The price, they're being killed at the moment. So that geopolitically, we're in a position to have a lot more independence vis-a-vis the Saudis and others by having this resource. So it's a very interesting and timely topic. It's not going to go away. Price volatility is going to remain in place. You wait. Prediction. You heard it here. Right? Everybody paying attention now? Sinai. Crazy jihadis are out killing people. They're going to kill some people near Port Said, which is the entry point for the Suez Canal. When they do, all those 20-something futures, petroleum futures contracts, traders, they're going to go, oh my God, the Suez is in danger. And you wait. The price will go up by 10, 15 bucks the next day. Prices are volatile because it's a globally traded and price-determined commodity, and because bad things are going to continue to happen. I'll stop right there. I hope this has been of some interest, and happy to take some questions.
What is the impact of this shift from coal to gas going to do to the environment? And in particular, what is fracking going to do to the environment?
I assume all of you heard the question. It's a right on the money sort of question. I mean, one thing you can say, as the President of the United States said, and I increasingly, as this fellow nears the end of his term, liking him more and more, you heard that from a Republican appointee too, by the way, is that it's a bridge fuel. Shale gas is enabling us to retire coal and have less of a carbon footprint. The data is a little bit hard to be clear about, but it seems that we were the only continent to have a reduced carbon footprint vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So it seems that air quality, the broader carbon footprint thing, the shift to shale gas, not perfect because it's hydrocarbons and it's being combusted and it has a residual, but apparently it combusts at something like 110% better than coal. I've forgotten the exact figures, but it's marketable. It's market and it's real. So the shift to gas is a bridge fuel to more renewables. One thing, by the way, very interesting at this point, you've seen people saying, well, the price of gasoline is now much lower, so therefore all of the movement toward renewables will stop dead in its tracks. Well, it's weird, it hasn't. There seems to be some kind of tipping point that's been reached, particularly with wind farms, where people are going ahead and installing these. The other story that people forget about completely is that the big energy companies think of themselves as energy companies, not just oil and gas. So you look at BP or Shell, 7 to 8%, 9% of their portfolios are in exactly this stuff, wind and solar. So it seems to me that there is a movement underway, economies of scale, the technology, all the rest of it. So that's ongoing too. The fracking thing is a very interesting question. There's no question but smaller firms taking shortcuts have put wells in where the sheathing, particularly at about 100 meters, where you've got to look after your groundwater, hasn't been done properly. But the great thing about this country is, and sometimes it's the perplexing thing about this country, is all these jurisdictions. You've got two in this state that say we're not having anything to do with fracking, right? And apparently, isn't there a Supreme Court case in Colorado where they're going to decide whether it's legal according to the state constitution to ban, any type of mining activity within a jurisdiction? But the the best thing that I can look at is that a lot of this comes from a Luddite response and a well-founded fear of what the oil and gas industry is capable of doing without being watched by regulations. You know, we're all able to remember Exxon Valdez, the BP issue in the Gulf, right? It's not exactly the industry that, you know, is squeaky clean, and that people are prepared to read the worst of their intentions. But I have looked at, and remember the slide I showed where the 3 or 4 things are intersecting? The guy is a National Geographic writer, and we've gone up to northern Pennsylvania to look into these stories of exploding faucets and all the rest of it. Dimmock is the name of the town. Yoko Ono and some celebrity friends came down from Manhattan in buses and distributed Fiji water to a group of astonished farmers. It was really an interesting story. You know, I mean, I'm sure they were well-intentioned, but you know, I'm not sure it was glowing blue and green from outer space. You know, in that part of Pennsylvania. I think broadly the impact of fracking the environment is transitional. I think there's some areas where it really matters. I think they haven't worked out the earthquake issue in Oklahoma, but I talked to the professor emeritus of, you know, earth seismology, you know, who's better than that? He was in the same audience as the other guy, stood up and scared me by knowing a lot more about horizontal drilling. And he said, we don't know. There's some places where pressure is causing small things, but there are other things that are going on subterranean that I mean, we had an earthquake in Washington, right? I live near the cathedral, the finials fell over. I suddenly found God again. I don't mean to treat your question lightly, it's just that I'm agnostic. I tend to think that don't take anybody's word for granted, but the regulatory response seems to me across the states, in Colorado as well, caps on methane, baseline studies in Wyoming. These are business-friendly states which have a regulatory response. And it seems to be addressing things. The other thing too is that with the economic environment being what it is, it's a merger and acquisition time. Some of the smaller firms are being acquired by the bigger ones. The bigger ones are correspondingly more interested in reputational risk and lawsuits. And beyond that, they're human beings that want to do the right thing.
I saw a hand up on this side over here. Yes.
With the increase globally of, I guess I would say, land-produced oil and gas, whatever, how is this likely to affect the global tanker fleet? Is this an industry that's doomed to go away, or are we good for another 10, 15 years with increasing?
Terrific question. I know, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but your point of your question is absolutely on mark. There's an expression, VLCCs. I love the energy industry because you learn, it's even better than the Pentagon. You know, all the acronyms in the Pentagon. Do you know what a FROG is? Free rocket over ground, right? So you learn a lot of acronyms in the Pentagon, but the VLCC is very large crude carrier. These things which are gargantuan. They can't fit through the Panama Canal. And what's the point of sending, I mean, for example, there's been a real fall off in the visits of these tankers to the United States because we have the stuff, right? The real question, by the way, for export, if we get into the LNG export business, is are we just going to like buy these things from Korea, or is there a chance to revive, again, selectively some of our shipyard capacity in joint ventures? I would like to think that we could do more than just build aircraft carriers and submarines. So it's complex, and your question identifies, and this is a market, you know, people trade in everything in this world, and people looking at container and, you know, haulage and the whole question of what ship tonnage and everything have really been foxed by the market several times. Right now, the demand for these ships is, to put it mildly, very low.
We have another question on this side, and I'll look for hands around the room.
Yeah, you mentioned briefly one of the barriers to transition in China from hydrocarbon to renewable, and you also mentioned the impetus due to the air pollution. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's actually happening in both China and India in terms of that transition?
It's a very complex response to your question. In India, you have a prime minister came in saying, I'm going to turn this system here, this lethargic, slow-moving thing into a dynamic economy, and we're going to do it just like the Chinese, and if we have to pollute our environments, we're going to do it. That's what he said. So India is pressing ahead to do this, and yet the air is unbreathable in Delhi and many of the inland cities. In China, it's more directly linked, I think, to, well, the trade-off is, do we have reduced economic dynamism, which is already happening because of their own financial system and some other issues? Or do we go ahead and continue to commission coal-fired power stations? There seems to be, with the slowdown, less requirement to have new electric capacity and therefore a chance to have a breather, literally and figuratively, and have some people come in and install gas turbines. But those are the key issues. And civil, what's the expression we use in this country? Civil society, NGOs, people pressing for it, have gotten nowhere in India. In fact, they're facing state government repression if they try to pick up the question of not burning coal. In China, the party knows that it just simply can't ask people to breathe this stuff. I mean, in very conservative terms, the cost economically, forget public health, but just economically, has been so quantified without any argument that the Chinese know they have to change. And remember, there's a model out there for doing this in Asia. And what's the model? Korea, South Korea, and Japan, which in the 70s said, God, our cities are really dirty. I can't see my neighbor's house. What's happening? And they said, well, let's go down and bring LNG from Southeast Asia, which is what they did. The reason why it's okay to breathe and live in Tokyo is because of that change, which happened 35, 40 years ago. The Chinese have got to do it too. Yes.
Yes, I read an article recently about questioning the economics of fracking.
Yes.
And they were saying that it cost $7 or $8 million to drill a well, and that what they were finding was that the wells were petering out after about 3 years. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Again, do not please cast me as a Pollyanna for the industry. There's, the whole question of depletion, which is what you're raising, which is, do you drill enough wells, and are they productive long enough so that you can sustain a believable reserve capacity, or do the wells give out more quickly? And remember, we're at a time where the depletion rate is being matched by far fewer wells being drilled. But every time I go and talk to people who are actually working the fields, that's what's cool about traveling around, Eagleford and Corpus Christi. These guys come out, they tend to be geologists, they worked in the field, and they said, no, there's so many ways to get back into existing wells and exploit them again. So it seems to me that those articles haven't talked to the people that I have. But the depletion rate is a real issue. But at the same time, remember, just out of, the graphs I showed you are spectacular and interesting, but they're coming from very few wells. And those wells many of them were already drilled before, and they're going back and re-engineering the extraction and getting more out of it. So I don't know, it goes back to that old argument about, what is it, peak oil, where the world's gonna run out of oil. And it never seems to sort of happen. But on the other hand, we're in a small planet where obviously things are finite. So I don't know, you make your choice.
We've got a couple questions in the center here. We'll get to you next.
Yeah, on the international politics side, your diagram showed the oil from the Middle East tending to go to Japan, China, that direction, and the U.S.'s production becoming energy independent. Why should we care about the Middle East? Why shouldn't that be the problem of the Chinese and the Japanese?
Well, much as I wished that we could think that way, because I tend to think the big issue is the emergence of China and the way in which they are comprehensively going to challenge us, as they are already. And I think the Middle East is a sinkhole in which we get stuck again and again. It's like the La Brea tar pit, right? But there are obvious lobbies in this country that want us to stay involved. My own view, and you didn't ask the question, but here is me being unsolicited again. I welcome the Iranian deal, which of course is anathema to my brethren and many in the Republican Party, and I do it because we're no longer standing astride the world like a colossus, as we did in 1946 or even at the end of the Cold War, right? So when you're no longer quite as powerful, when you become more primus inter pares, the Latin phrase for first among equals, or the greatest of great powers, then you need to be smarter and not get involved with wars, no matter what terrible things are happening. And that means, diplomatically, a policy of equidistance and solving things which are driven by particular lobbies. Cuba have been waiting to be forgotten. Look, oh, is there outrage in the paper every day? Nobody gives a stuff, right? It's already happened. Burma, oh my God, you should have seen the public, the human rights NGOs in Washington when, oh my God, this is terrible, and Aung San Suu Kyi, and dear, well, it happened. And it happened for important reasons, because why were we giving the Chinese a free ride in a really important, pivotal Southeast Asian state? That's why it has to happen. And similarly, I can't stand the people in Iran. Using my New Zealand passport before, I went there and covered the place. I like the country, but they're run by maniacs. Okay, and so what? Not talking to them is going to make them change their behavior? I've never understood this argument. So the politics of seeking equidistance, of being able to say, you know what, we're going to kind of normalize with Iran. And if you don't like it, Israel, find a way to deal with it, right? And if you don't like it, Saudi, too bad for you, because it's our interests which are involved, and why should we be whipsawed by a particular constituency all the time? The trouble is that's equated with not being interested in Israel's survival, which I am hugely, as we all are. But I think the problem is that we were too long put in this situation where we would just automatically say no. I hope I can continue with an anecdotal thing too. I was going off to Beirut when I was in the government to see both Hamas and Hezbollah as a university professor at the National Defense University. I got a phone call from the daughter of an extremely prominent American politician. I mean, think of the top two and you didn't have to get. And Liz Cheney said, why are you getting on that plane? I said, well, this is a good chance for us to find out what these guys are thinking. He said, no, we have no contact. What? You have no contact with your enemies? You gotta have special contact with your enemies, right? You gotta fake them out. You gotta find out what they're thinking. Gotta find out where they're spooked by something and who they hate and all the rest of it. Gotta be clever. Not go from 0 to 60, which is we're doing nothing, or let's go bomb them because bad things are happening. Now think of how primitive our political culture has become, that we have no idea what to do except go attack somebody. Senator, what's his name from Arizona, beyond belief, he should go enjoy his grandchildren instead of calling for the wrath of American bombs on all these people. So I tend to think, sorry, you got a lot more than you asked for in your question. But that's what I think, man. And I was out there watching us totally mess it up. Not because we're bad, but because we didn't have a clue, right? And we tried to empower people who hadn't been in power, the Southern Shia, since 1000 AD, right? And even then it's problematic. And all of what's happened is consequential on that grave error. And yet we still want to pretend. We still want to square the circle, and we can't. So I agree with you about the Middle East. Stay away from it. Find local allies who do your bidding, but don't get involved, ever again. Boom, over and out.
I have a couple other questions here.
I just have a quick question. You mentioned the Keystone Pipeline, and perhaps I'm wrong, but I had the impression at least part of the problem was that the source of the fluids that would be coming through the Keystone Pipeline were the tar sands.
No, you're phrasing that very delicately. And you're quite right. That's the whole point of it.
So, and that's kind of an environmental disaster up there that I think that people were trying to well, it is. I'm sorry if you don't agree, but it is.
No, I think that was
and I think that people were trying to stay away from, these tar sands. You don't need to go into tar sands. We've got all this shale gas.
Madam, we're in violent agreement. We're in violent agreement.
Okay.
I'm not making a pitch for Canadian tar sands.
So you can have all kinds of gas pipelines cutting across the country, but you don't need to source it with tar sands.
Madam, I entirely agree. But remember, the Keystone was thought to also be engineered to accept tight oil, which means oil from shale from the Bakken field as well, was going to feed into it. I think 10% of overall envisaged flow. But the whole thing is moot, to use that rarely used legal word, because of the price at the moment. And also because of a sense of, is this really what we need? It was all contemplated at a different price environment. The one thing that's often mentioned by the Canadians when I speak to them is, oh, we better do this otherwise, and then they lower their voice and mutter conspiratorially at you and say, otherwise, the Chinese will take it all. I think, well, all right, let them. Sell to China, that's right. See, that's playing to this idea that we should be, what's that fancy word? Autarchical, we should be self-sufficient in energy. I mean, if the Canadians want to sell it to China, fine. It's horribly expensive to extract that stuff. And it seems to be, to get to this gentleman's other over here question, environmentally, not the happiest process to visit on Mother Earth. So I think it's a question of, as opposed to that, which involves gouging out huge mounds and whole questions of tailings and ground pollution, the subterranean problems with fracking seem to be mostly addressed by a really robust regulatory response. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think it's enabling us to displace coal, which I think is a net good.
Yes, right here. Okay, my question was also about the Keystone Pipeline, and you answered a lot of it, but it seems at one time it was in the news a lot of discussion about it, and recently we're not hearing anything about it in the political debate. And is that what you just said? It's because nobody needs it right now, because it's not financially advantageous to anybody?
The interests that were funding it, that wanted it to happen, and the political interests behind them all have to be realigned in a different price environment. And also, as shale development loomed each year more and more impressively, the economic rationale, even in a high price environment, for tar sands became less and less compelling. So what I'm saying is that in a lot of well-intentioned people's minds, pipelines have become ipso facto bad things. And it's just not true.
I have a question. You mentioned political policy, somewhat, government policy having a positive impact on the graphs that you showed.
Yeah.
Would you tell us the pros and cons of the most recent government policies? And with CNN's gathering tomorrow at the Reagan Library, I expect we'll hear predictions on what we should see in the future. What would be your wish to see change in our government policy?
Ooh. Right, I'm going to lock all the doors. You can't escape a 55-minute diatribe from me. No, look, nothing changes that quickly, and yet things change quickly. You look at early 20th century pictures of street life in Manhattan. From one decade start, there were nothing but horse-drawn drays, and within a decade, it was motor cars. Things can change rapidly. The Tesla, the whole question of electric cars, that's big and is out there. Just I mentioned to you before the wind farm. No, you just look it up on any search engine, wind farm current investment. It's going up because we've reached the tipping point, it seems, right? Solar, again, seems to be really coming strong, irrespective of whether there's the subsidies that everybody thought had to be there to make it work. I think another thing is, let's somehow, if we can, get past our aversion to having fast, efficient railways. I just don't understand this country. I simply don't get it. I remember there was a governor in Indiana, you may remember when the Obama administration, the first one, had its stimulus, and there was a there was a rapid rail component of it, and some governor of a Midwest state or something, I forget, he said, "What? Rapid trains?" He said, "What do we want to be like?" As if this was an obvious rhetorical question. Do we want to be like France? And I thought, yeah, I want to be like France. I want good baguettes and clean food, and go to Lyon, and you just take the train and you get to Paris, an hour. I mean, what's the matter with that? No, I'd rather sit for 3.5 hours every day in some stupid traffic jam. So, it seems to me, and it's been quantified, it's a bit like Chinese air pollution consequential impact on the economy. It's been quantified how much we lose as an economy. If that's the only way it's going to make us change, we'll go, oh, sitting around for 3.5 hours in a car is okay, but gosh, we're losing money, so we'll have to change what we're doing. You know, seems to me that there's a huge cost in having all of these engines idling, turning over. So can't we kind of get serious about regional rapid rail, not as a replacement, but as a supplement, particularly since we'll be able to generate the power for it really cheaply. So that's what I think. It will never happen. This is America.
Only here. Do we have any other questions this evening? Oh, very good. 2 more.
I'm not sure this is a wrap-up question, but one of your slides showed that China is the biggest coal user in the world by quite a bit, or at least the biggest polluter on the basis of their coal-fired power system. It also showed that China was the second largest, has the second largest reserve of shale gas.
Yes.
Are they doing anything with that?
They're challenged because it's up in the north in the Manchurian area where water resources are limited. The ground table is very weak and it's hard to reach. And that wouldn't stop the Chinese generally, you know, using up all the water they have already. I mean, the water table in China is a disaster with or without shale development anyway. But the short answer is yes, but it's very hard to get at. That's why the Chinese are looking very carefully at new fracking technologies which use esoterica like polypropylene, which is injected in pelletized form, and then this sounds weird, but they get liquid nitrogen and then they heat it up and they ram it in and it combusts and without using water achieves the fracturing. So the short answer is yeah, they got an awful lot. The other thing too, by the way, is nobody's got a very good handle on the extent of shale reserves around the world. It's really very, very early days.
Our last question of the evening.
My last question is, can I ask 5 more questions? No,
Sure. I'm sure all of them will agree.
This gentleman's comment, I noticed that one slide where you were showing the shale reserves, that there was nothing shown in China or Russia, and I just wondered if that just...
Yeah. Well, I somewhat answered it earlier. The question is the existence of and accuracy of the estimates of shale reserves in these places. And the answer is it's very, very early days. Governments that are authoritarian tend to sit on information. They regard it as something that they want to tell other companies. By the way, there's a very important benefit to the shale revolution to the United States in visibles. Those of you who know trade accounts know that there's visibles is like goods and services. Invisibles is advice, consulting advice. And you know, we possess the firms that understand how to get at this stuff as well. But the short answer is the thing that I mentioned earlier, like subsurface mineral rights, that's killed it in Poland. Poland's got a lot of reserves. And here's a lovely little story to finish it up with, and I know you all have to go. Bulgaria, the country I was about to visit but didn't, so I could finish my book, ho ho. They were about to invite Chevron in to do fracking there. And then the KGB, now in its current guise, suddenly discovered it was an environmental advocate and started agitating through its fronts in Bulgaria against the desecration of the sacred Bulgarian soil. And they stopped fracking in its tracks because, of course, the Russians would prefer to sell gas to Bulgaria than have the Bulgarians have their own. So politics rears its ugly head again and again. I hope this has been of use to you, Madam President.
Thank you.